Hey, everybody, welcome. Happy Saturday from Tennessee. We have better weather. It's in the last hour, super sunny. Now we've got our clouds back, so I can actually see you, see comments, see the screen in front of me. That's awesome. Welcome, Tim. Good to see you. All right, have you ever noticed that the loudest voices in your head are usually the ones full of doubt, fear, or grief? But underneath all that noise, there's often a quieter voice, one that lingers, just waiting for space. Today, we're going to talk about how to listen for it. Hey, friends, welcome to From the Threshold. I am Renee Hill, and each Saturday I come to you from my own front porch, my literal threshold, to offer a moment of reflection for anyone living a creative life. My hope is that this becomes a place where you can reconnect with your own creative story with a little more compassion and a little more joy. Wherever you're listening from, I am so glad that you're here. In this Art of Change series that we've been walking through step by step, we've been going through the Rediscover You framework, which is 5 phases that help us reconnect with ourselves through creativity in seasons of change. We began with Root, where we learned how to stabilize and ground ourselves when everything feels uncertain. Then we moved into Remember, where we honored the stories and threads from our past that are still worth carrying forward. Last week, we talked about Release, which was loosening the false narratives and outdated roles that weigh us down. This week, we enter the 4th phase, which is called Reveal. This is the moment when, in the quiet after release, a different kind of voice begins to surface. Not necessarily loud or polished, but subtle. They can be fragments of truth waiting for us to notice. And to show you what that can look like, I want to start with a story. For a long time, I believed that I was not, quote, a true artist, a real artist. Here's why. I could not just walk up to an easel and start painting. I couldn't put color on a canvas and just see where it led me. I love seeing intuitive painting. I love watching intuitive painters. But when I try it, when I attempt it, it never seems to hold meaning for me. I need structure. I need limits, a concept, a framework, a boundary to create inside of. If I don't have some kind of direction, internal direction or external direction, I feel lost, unmoored, like the work literally carries no meaning. And I told myself that disqualifies me. Real artists, I thought, were intuitive. They could listen to some mysterious inner flow and let it guide them. They didn't need edges or guardrails. They could just make stuff up and create. So the loud voice in my head said, "You're not like that, so you're not real." And that voice stayed with me for years, decades. It showed up every time that I compared myself to someone who seemed effortless in their creativity. It showed up every time that I considered taking art seriously. It told me I was too much like a designer, not enough like an artist. But underneath that voice, there's another voice, quieter, harder to hear. Didn't shout, it just kept lingering and waiting for me to pay attention. That voice kept showing me that structure and concepts weren't my enemies. They were my way of tuning in. When I gave myself a boundary or a framework or a limitation or a concept, my creativity comes alive. An assignment like designing a quilt around the idea of looking up at trees, looking up at the sky, suddenly ideas would just come. I made 2 of them and then I wrote the patterns and I could have gone on. I had way more ideas. I could give myself a prompt, a set of rules, and watch how my imagination played with them. For years, I didn't understand that as, quote, legitimate creativity because it didn't fit the story that I believed about what creativity was really like. But when I finally began to listen and trusted the way that my creativity wanted to show up, I realized that I had been tuned in all along. I was listening to my creativity. I was just listening differently. And that has changed everything because now I understand creativity differently and I know myself better. This is the gift of listening. As an aside, after learning a lot more about what creativity really is, about the nature of creativity, I understand that it is often engaged through problem solving, through bumping up against guardrails and edges. My understanding was flawed to begin with. So last week we talked about how release creates space and how important it is to be intentional about what you carry forward so that you don't just slip back into those old stories. Here's the nuance. Filling that space doesn't always mean rushing to define it. Sometimes the most powerful next step is to wait and to listen. Listening is its own kind of creativity. It's giving attention to the unfinished, to the half formed, to the things that don't yet have words. And that can feel uncomfortable because we live in a world that prizes clarity, quick answers, tidy labels. Silence and uncertainty makes it feel like something is wrong. So we tend to fill up the space in our days and in our minds so that we don't have silence, so that we don't have to listen. We're afraid of what we might hear. But listening is what allows the deeper voice underneath the noise to make its way through. That voice is rarely loud. It doesn't push forward, it lingers, it waits for space, and when we give it our attention, even for moments, it might surprise us. This is the heart of reveal, learning to pause long enough for what's truest in you to rise to the surface. Learning to be comfortable enough in this in-between space to pay attention to what we might learn. In these in-between spaces, our minds often fixate on the discomfort. We replay what's been lost. We brace ourselves for what's ahead. Fear and grief can get so loud that they feel like the only story in the room. But listening in this sense isn't about emptying yourself into silence. It's about choosing what you pay attention to, what you give your precious attention to. Psychology tells us that what we notice actually changes how we experience the world. Attention is never neutral. It strengthens whatever we focus on. So if we stay locked on the noise gets louder. But if we practice listening for the subtle voice beneath it, that voice grows stronger. And that's where our agency returns, even in seasons of transition where so many things feel uncertain. You still have a choice about what to attend to. Listening becomes an act of creativity in itself, a way of shaping your inner landscape, a way of saying, I will not be defined only by loss and fear. I will give my attention to the thread of possibility beneath those. So if this voice is always there, why do we often miss it? Part of that is cultural. We live in a world that rewards speed and clarity and output. The person who speaks first, who fills that silence, is the one who gets heard. So we learn to value volume. Part of it is emotional. In times of change, grief and fear can take up all the air in the room. These emotions are loud. They demand our attention, and it can feel impossible to hear anything else. Part of it is also internal. We carry self-doubt, perfectionism, that little critic's voice in our head that tells us that we're silly or wrong, that our nudges don't mean anything, so we tune them out before we ever give them a chance. So you put all of that together, the cultural noise, the emotional noise, the internal noise. Is it any wonder that the quiet voice inside of us gets drowned out? When we do give it space, that inner voice shows up, and it rarely comes as a full plan or a perfect sentence. More often it comes as a fragment, a piece, a word, a color, a hunger, a sense. And that may not seem like much, may not seem like enough, but everything begins with one brushstroke, one note of music, one line in a journal, one small kernel of an idea. Listening is how we catch those fragments and begin before they blow past us. The more we practice, the more attuned we become. We start to notice patterns, a word that repeats, a color that keeps tugging, a longing that just won't leave us alone. Listening in this way is like collecting small threads. And when enough threads gather, they begin to weave themselves together into something whole. This is where creativity becomes such a powerful tool because it gives us a way to listen with our hands and our hearts and not just our minds. When you doodle in the margins, when you let your pen wander, when you stitch without a plan, you are giving your inner voice another language to speak in. Sometimes it's easier to notice what wants to surface when you're not staring right at it. Maybe you're journaling and without meaning to, that same word shows up 3 different times on the page. Maybe you're sketching and you realize that you've drawn the same shape over and over again, like a doorway or a spiral or a tree. Maybe you're quilting or embroidering and you keep reaching for the same color thread even when it doesn't, quote, match. Maybe you're at the piano and one note keeps tugging at you, wanting to be played over and over. These aren't usually accidents. They can be signals. They're ways that your inner voice makes itself visible. That's why creative practice is such a good listening practice. It slows us down, it engages our senses, and it bypasses the critic in our head. And because it's embodied, it lives in our physical nature, involving eye and hand and breath, helps us notice truths that we might otherwise overlook. Listening doesn't always happen in a single sitting. Sometimes we create the right space with a sketchbook open or fabric in our hands or a journal page waiting, and nothing really comes right away. That does not mean that it's failed, that it doesn't work. It means that listening is often also a practice over time. Just like we don't always hear a friend's voice the first time they say our name, our inner voice sometimes needs us to lean in again and again before we can actually tune in to its frequency. That's why creative practice matters so much. It puts us in the posture of availability. It keeps us open week after week until the fragment that belongs to us finally rises into view. Listening is less about forcing clarity and more about being present long enough for that clarity to find us. Creativity becomes a kind of mirror, not to show us what's polished or planned, but to reflect back the fragments that are already stirring beneath the noise. So as you think about this week, here are a few questions that you can carry with you. What small creative act could put me in the posture of listening this week? I will tell you, for me, it's free writing, which doesn't sound like a creative practice, but it is an opening for a creative practice. Here's another question. When I get quiet, what word or color or image keeps returning? And what noise tends to drown it out? You don't have to answer these all at once. Sometimes the most important part is just letting that question linger and noticing what surfaces when you're not really forcing an answer. Fear and doubt may always be loud. We can't eliminate them entirely, and we really wouldn't want to. They do serve a purpose. But they get the final word. We get to choose where our attention goes. So this week, notice what repeats. Notice what's tugging at you subtly. Notice what keeps surfacing when you give yourself even a few moments of space. Because in those fragments, you may hear the beginnings of your own voice emerging. And next week, we'll take the next step together. We'll learn how to give that voice shape in the return phase of this process. As I've been preparing next week's workshop and journal on voice. Sneak peek. That's the next month's focus. I've realized that how much this moment of reveal sets the stage. We can't speak with clarity until we have first learned to listen. So this week is about tuning in, and next month we'll explore how to give that voice its shape in the world, especially if your voice has been silenced for a long time and you've started to doubt its value. I'm really excited about where it's leading. And of course, I'll be right here again next Saturday on the threshold. If you'd like to come on back, I would love to have you. Until then, stay passionately curious.